Right, hello everyone. What I'm going to do in this next 30 minutes is talk about some aspects of environmental science that we study at Trinity and really focus on an area that is receiving increasingly more government funding. And this is looking at the mitigation of increasing productivity in the agricultural sector with regards to the environmental threats of greenhouse gas emissions. And before we start, just to talk a bit about environmental sciences at Trinity, it's taught within the School of Natural Sciences, and your first 2 years will be the general science course, and then you'll specialise in the final 2 years. And in fact, within the School of Natural Sciences, we have degree programs in earth sciences, functional biology, that sort of comparative physiology of organisms, geography, geology, plant sciences, and zoology. Now, we have a sort of friendly rivalry between zoology because zoology is so popular. And believe it or not, for every environmental plant science student in the world, there is about 500 zoology students. So the ramifications of that means that, in fact, there are quite a few lucrative jobs for plant scientists and environmental plant scientists. Just to illustrate this, we've been pushing this today, but these statistics are from the UK, from a HEA study, which is focusing on graduate employment 8 months after these students receive their degrees. And of course, the first one is medicine. That's not surprising, at approximately €38,600 a year. Then we have dentistry, and then we have plant science. So that's the third most lucrative career choice, shall we say, in the UK. But what I want to talk about are these greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and the burps and bubbles. Well, the first burp will be methane, and then the bubbles that we're interested in will obviously be carbon dioxide, and also laughing gas, nitrous oxide. And what these three gases all have in common is their ability to absorb in the infrared part of the spectrum, and therefore re-radiate and also warm the planet. So these are our sort of classic ideas of greenhouse gases. And we always focus on carbon dioxide, but in fact carbon dioxide is not as effective as the other two greenhouse gases in enforcing the climate. It's just that there's so much carbon dioxide out there. So we can relate everything to the global warming potential of CO2. So if we call that 1, and we look at nitrous oxide, then that is 310 times better, shall we say, than carbon dioxide in enforcing the climate. And if we look at methane, then that's about 21 times better than carbon dioxide at forcing the climate. But these are our three important greenhouse gases that arise from the agricultural sector. And of course, we're interested in these because Ireland is a signature to the KYOTO Protocol, which in fact is coming to an end next year. And the agreement was really to allow Ireland to increase its greenhouse gas emissions by about 13% compared with a baseline of 1990 emissions. But overall, across Europe, then we're looking at an 8% reduction. And this was adopted in 1997, and it came into force in 2005. And really, this sort of flexibility with regards to Ireland's contribution sort of went to our heads, shall we say, because here we've got the target, this is our Kyoto limit, and this is Ireland's emissions of total greenhouse gases, and we can see that we see a rapid increase here from 1990 all the way peaking at around about 2003, 2004. And in fact, it's only these past 2 years that we see ourselves back on target here. And unfortunately, that really has nothing to do with legislation, but merely the downturn in the economic climate. And Kyoto is finishing next year. There is going to be some more stringent EU legislation with regards to greenhouse gas emissions that will come into play. And unfortunately, we're not going to meet those targets at all. And in fact, it's exacerbated by the fact that agriculture is the major contributor to our nation's greenhouse gas budget. In fact, we can see here's agriculture. It's about 20,000 kilotons of CO2 equivalent. And the government is investing heavily in an increased milk and beef production, and that is going to have alarming effects on the contribution of the agricultural sector to this total greenhouse gas budget. So as environmental scientists, it's important therefore to measure these gases, come up with some sort of mitigating strategy. Okay, so where do these gases arise from? There is sort of a wrong assumption by many about where methane comes from in cattle. And in fact, methane comes from here. 90% is belched out of the cattle. That makes the experiments nice and clean to do. And we're not really interested in the other 10% that comes out there. Now, if we look at nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, then really carbon dioxide comes from respiration of the soil. And within the soil we'll have a plant component, respiration of roots, and respiration of microorganisms and invertebrates. But the interesting gas is this laughing gas, nitrous oxide, and that arises from specific microbial reactions that occur in the soil on the addition of either inorganic or organic nitrogen. And basically these microbes use this nitrogen as an energy source, and one of the byproducts is this greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, which will percolate through the soil and into the atmosphere. And we're involved in direct measurements of these gases at Trinity. And in fact, we've got quite an active research group that's received significant funding. Over the past 10 years, it's about $1.5 million. So we can see that within this sector, which will be expanding, there will be significant career opportunities. But in this slide, we can just compare where the bulk of our greenhouse gases in terms of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide are coming from. And primarily, it's grazed and cut pastures as opposed to animal crops. So we've got a higher soil respiration quotient with our cut and grazed pasture, and we've got a high yield of nitrous oxide. And I've just converted this into carbon dioxide equivalents. And we can see a significant reduction in the evolution of nitrous oxides in our arable fields, depending upon what sort of tillage management we adopt. So the problem would seem to be primarily cut and grazed pastures. And of course, Ireland is very efficient in producing high-quality grass-fed beef. And it's really not carbon dioxide, but methane and nitrous oxide which are the problem, particularly if we consider the increase in the milk and beef sector that's going to occur. And here we've got 1 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents, so methane is by far the guilty party at about 14 million tonnes, whereas nitrous oxide is about 9 million tonnes and decreasing. But of course, as we increase the size of our dairy and beef herd, then these are going to increase dramatically. But where are these values coming from? And this highlights really a requirement by scientists to actually come up with verifiable data that we can be confident in. And in fact, you'll be forgiven to believe that what we have across Ireland are many measuring stations all taking these measurements of nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide within a range of different soil types, different crops, different geographic areas. That's the ideal. Unfortunately, the reality is this, that we rely, in the main, not on direct measurements at all, but we rely upon a published equation that relates the amount of nitrogen that's applied to soils with regards to how much nitrous oxide is evolved. And this is a significant shortcoming. It's not just for Ireland, it's for all of the countries that have signed up to the KYOTO Protocol. The limiting factor is having reliable measurements. And again, this is where expansion in this employment sector will be. But basically what happens is we get a calculation of the total amount of nitrogen fertilizer that's applied, and basically 1% of that is going to be emitted as nitrous oxide. And there are some obvious significant variation within that, but across the country we assume that that relationship is the same. And in simple terms, we can say, okay, 2% of the total amount of nitrogen that's excreted onto our paddocks, that will be also released as nitrous oxide. So in the main, therefore, Ireland is not relying on defined measurements, but is using an equation that's been adopted across Europe. But it is vital to understanding the problem that the Irish agricultural sector faces to be more confident in calculating not only stocks of carbon, but also fluxes of carbon and these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And that requires measurements that are in fact significantly expensive to make. If we look at a grassland, then we're going to have to make measurements of methane, of soil respiration, and also of nitrous oxide with regards to fertilizer addition. And we've got to construct these carbon, these greenhouse gas budgets, should I say. It's a bit simpler for the arable sector, and in fact there's more flexibility in controlling greenhouse gases from the arable sector. With regards to cut and graze grasslands, well, this is our problem, methane. We can change the diet of the cattle. We can slaughter the cattle far younger than they're normally slaughtered. And in fact, there are various chemical treatments you can apply to the soil that inhibit the microflora that produce nitrous oxide. But really, our ammunition, so to speak, to reduce greenhouse gases within the dairy and beef sector is limited. Not so with the arable crops. With arable crops, we can actually alter the amount of fertilizer we apply. In fact, I'm involved in a European-wide project, which is really reinventing the wheel. It's bringing back legumes into agriculture. And also we can alter the sort of management methods, the tillage methods with regards to our cereal crops that will reduce nitrous oxide emissions. But all of these require careful and expensive and labour-intensive measurements. And in fact, you get these carbon budgets being developed. This one is from a project that we're involved in about 10 years ago. And for this grassland here, when you measure all of these variables, add up all the sums, we actually find that this paddock system here is taking up carbon dioxide into the soils. So it's what we call a carbon sink. And of course, that's favourable. That's a favourable situation. Now, what else is involved is looking at the extent of nitrogen pollution. And environmental scientists are involved in measuring the extent of pollution from the agricultural sector. And in fact, last year, there was published for the first time a nitrogen budget for the whole of Europe. And the important sort of information that was coming out from that report was that of all the nitrogen protein that we actually import from abroad, like soybean from South America, then only 15% of that is used for direct consumption. 85% is actually going to feed to feed the animals. And we can actually therefore calculate what the cost is for that aspect of agricultural pollution. And it's estimated that within Europe, it's costing about €740 a year for each person. This level of nitrogen pollution that is arising from agriculture. Okay, so that's just a bit of the background of the problem. Where do environmental scientists fit in with regards to a solution? The first thing, obviously, is to make better measurements to be more confident in the greenhouse budgets that we're producing. And if we take methane, then life would be so simple if all the cattle were like Swallow. Now, Swallow, believe it or not, is the world's smallest cow, and she's a Dexter. She's in Yorkshire, and she's about 85 centimetres tall. And believe it or not, there is a rabbit that is bigger than her. And this is the rabbit. This is Darius. So Darius is the world's biggest rabbit, and he weighs an amazing 22 kilos, and he actually stands taller than Swallow, this Dexter cow. So life would be so simple if we could work on nice, gentle cattle like Swallow, but unfortunately, it's not that simple. And what we have to do is attach these pipes around the cattle's neck, and in fact, we evacuate this, so this is a vacuum, and then they wear a halter, and there's a pipe that just ends below their nose, so all of the belching of the methane that these cattle do can be captured and stored within this contraption here. In fact, we can see it better perhaps in this photograph here. So this is the collar that we attach to our cattle, and then the pipe just ends just immediately here. And then that's a very effective way of trapping our methane. As I say, we're only interested in 90% of the methane that comes out, obviously at the front. Soil respiration is more labour intensive, and we use a bit of equipment which is called an infrared gas analyzer. And this is one of my research students from a few years back, and his project was to take direct measurements of soil respiration in both grazed systems and also arable systems. And he came from India, and he hated the Irish climate. And you can see that he's fully kitted up with a waterproof jacket, but also we look after our research students in Trinity. So if you can just spot, he also insisted on taking an umbrella with him wherever he went. But anyway, so that was a project. These are very repetitive measurements that you have to take, but they are incredibly important if we're trying to construct a carbon budget. So how do we measure respiration? Well, what we have to do is remove our top vegetation and primarily just plop down this infrared gas analyzer and measure the amount of carbon dioxide that is accumulating in this chamber. And we take about 20 or so measurements every 2 hours for an intensive sort of sampling period. Now, when it comes to measuring nitrous oxide, then what we have are what are called steady-state chambers or static chambers inserted in the field. Here we have a collar. This is about 1 foot square here. Here we've got a metal collar which we insert into the ground. And then when that chamber is rested on that collar, that's an airtight seal. So as the nitrous oxide percolates through the soil, it will accumulate in this chamber, and there's a little valve at the top, and we can take gas samples at various time points, and we can measure directly the nitrous oxide in that air sample by using a technique which is called gas chromatography. This is a photograph of some of our studies that are in Carlo, and this is the spring barley field. And straight away, we can see that for accurate measurements of greenhouse gases, we need lots and lots of different replicates. So here, there's over 40 of these chambers, in fact, laid out in this one experiment. There are systems that we use that allow measurements of photosynthesis, not using small chambers, but actually measuring photosynthesis and gas exchange at the level of an entire field. And here we've got this in this photograph here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a bit of kit here. We've got a weather station, and then we've got a gas sampling unit here, which basically sucks in the air and measures the carbon dioxide. So what we've got are eddies of carbon dioxide coming off from the ground, which are then collected by this bit of equipment here. The amount of CO2 is determined again by this infrared gas analysis system. And if we know the wind direction and the wind speed, we can calculate the footprint of the ground from which all of this gas is being collected. So we can measure photosynthesis in terms of an entire field. In fact, if we put one of these bits of equipment on top of a spike, and the top of a constree, we could look at gas exchange over the whole of Dublin. And these are very accurate bits of equipment. So here on this graph, whatever is below is carbon dioxide that is taken up by the vegetation. And then what we've got on here is carbon dioxide that actually is being emitted by the soil. So this is respiration on the top, and this is photosynthesis. And we can see that photosynthesis peaks, obviously, at midday, then collapses, and then we've got this nighttime respiration. But once we have a signage cut, we can clearly see how sensitive this equipment is. Photosynthesis obviously stops, and here we've got measurements of respiration. So environmental scientists are involved not only in these measurements, these accurate measurements of greenhouse gases, but also in the simulation of greenhouse gas emissions across agriculture. Because the limiting factor is how much these measurements take and also how much these measurements cost. It's impossible to fund the measurement of gas across the whole environment. So what we do is measure greenhouse gases from typical crops on on a range of different soil types. And we attempt to model nitrous oxide production and soil respiration. So you can come up with conceptual models for soil processes. And this is just one that we were working on a few years ago. We can see that respiration is driven by different substrates. There's a different component of the respiration. And after all the sort of jiggery-pokery figures, hopefully we get results that match measured rates of soil respiration. So this is data from a massive field experiment that some of my students did. This is total respiration here, and then we've got root respiration, and then we've got microbial respiration. So it is possible to take these accurate measurements and then attempt to produce computer simulation models. And here's some data from one that we're working on at the moment. And we can see that there's an excellent agreement between our measured rates of soil respiration in black and also our modelled rates of soil respiration. And we can use this then to predict what will happen as the climate changes in the future. And we can see if we're going to have an increased soil respiration as the soils warm. With nitrous oxide, then our research students are involved in developing a computer simulation model that's readily available, and it's called DNDC. And I don't want to go into any detail really there, but just to underline that, again, we're getting excellent fit between measured data and modelled data. So all we have to do is look at the close agreement between the open circles and the closed circles, or the open squares and closed squares, or the open triangles or closed triangles. All they're saying is that one value is a model value, the other value is a direct measured value. And this really is the state of play at the moment with regards to measuring greenhouse gas emissions. We've just been awarded $200,000 to develop this further by the EPA. So what's happening is that we're moving away now from taking these measurements. We're moving more to calibrating computer simulation models that will take into account the great variability of soil types across Ireland and also different crops, different management systems. And hopefully, therefore, spatially, we'll be able to have more confidence in the figures that we submit. And also, it allows us to look at various mitigation strategies. And just to finish with some outputs from a computer simulation, then here we've got a year, and here we're looking at nitrous oxide emissions. We have a peak in late winter, early spring, which is associated with rainfall. Then we have a second peak, which is associated with the addition of fertilizer. And then we have a third peak here, which is associated with plant residues breaking down and providing substrate for these soil microflora to produce nitrous oxide. And all I want you to see is that the dark circles are present-day conditions, and then as we input what we think is going to happen with regards to the climate, we can see that as soil temperature increases, as we get changes in seasonal rainfall, then unfortunately our nitrous oxide levels will increase. But the take-home message is that there is excellent employment in the future with regards to environmental scientists within the agricultural sector. And in January, the SFI are going to launch a grant initiative which is called Smart Agriculture. And also we've got the Department of Agriculture supporting research funding related to mitigation of greenhouse gases that are going to occur as we increase our milk and beef industry. So hopefully, just by focusing on this small aspect of environmental science, you can see that it's a fascinating area and also one that offers significant employment. Now, I am going to be downstairs at the environmental science desk till about 3:30 if any of you wish to ask any further questions. Okay, thank you very much.